Job chapter 1. We have been doing a study on the book of Job on Wednesday nights. And it has been an exciting time together. I don't know that I have ever done a study through the book of Job, but some of the benefits of that are things that you discover as a byproduct of that study. And we came across one of those about 2 weeks ago. And I'd like for us to begin by reading at the opening part of the book of Job. Job chapter 1 and beginning at verse 13. It is probably one of the most painful chapters in all of Scripture to read, because it's the account of Job's life when he loses everything that he had. All of his children, all of his possessions. And we're going to begin with a reading of the account of that at verse 13. Let me set it up by saying that God had allowed Job to go through a time of testing in his life. And it wasn't because Job had done anything wrong, it was because God was allowing him to pass through a period of testing. By God's own testimony about Job, he said, Job is a righteous man. He runs away from evil. He has nothing to do with evil in his life. And God allows this period of testing to come into his life. And although all the tests that we have cannot be attributed to this kind of activity, there are times in our lives when God allows us to pass through a difficult season. All of us are old enough to know that that's true. You can speak to that out of your own personal experience, very likely. That there are times when God allows, and it seems to come out of nowhere, and it seems to have no rhyme or reason to it. It just shows up. And God does allow those seasons to come. There are many seasons of testing in our lives that come at my own initiation. Can you relate to that? That was a very weak response. It is true. But in this particular case with Job, it's a season of testing. And here is how Job was first initiated into this time in his life, beginning at verse 13. One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, do you get a pattern here? While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Now, let me just stop there. What do you think you would do if you got, 4 different people that came, and while one was still speaking, the other showed up, and the other, and the other, and the other. What do you think your response might be at that point? Really?
I give up.
What did you say, Hesty?
I would be thinking that God had protected me.
Yeah. God, what did I do to deserve this? Right? That's kind of human reasoning, is it not? I mean, by God's own opinion of Job, he said he is a righteous man, unique in all the earth. He turns away from evil, and he pleases me. And Job is saying, why? Why is this happening? Okay? And we can all identify with the humanity of that response, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Verse 20. At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in what? Worship. And he fell to the ground in worship and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. What these last verses reveal to us is a picture of worship. The title of my message this morning is The Heart of Worship. And it's not to focus on all the calamity that Job went through, as tragic and as appealing as that might be to delve into that. It's for us to pause and to see on Job's worst day, his response to these circumstances was to bow in worship. That's what caught my attention. As a matter of fact, we were actually in the Bible study on Wednesday night, and we were just commenting on some of the verses in the text, and it leaped from the page at me. Look at Job's response. I mean, I think I had always noticed that Job did not charge God in foolishly in any kind of way, but I didn't see that he had vowed, that his first response was to bow in worship of God, as all of the servants came to tell him what had happened that day. Now, most folks, as we've already discussed, receiving that kind of message would be overcome by grief, and certainly we can all understand that. There's nothing wrong or inappropriate about that. That too is very human for us. But not only does Job worship, but in so doing, he reveals the heart of worship. His heart. The heart that produces worship in our lives. The heart that responds to God in acts of worship. There have always been different opinions about worship, about what worship is. Some have seen worship as a very formal thing, and they have a very strict, rigid, even have a term for it, liturgy. If you came from a high church background, Catholic, Episcopalian, Lutheran, to some degree Methodist, you are familiar with a liturgy, and it's a set liturgy. It's the same every week, and that is the approach to worship. And I'm not here to say that that's a bad thing. I'm here to say it's just different, and it's one way that worship is conducted. Some see worship as more emotional and high energy. Anybody ever watch T.D. Jakes on Sunday afternoon? That's high energy. That is emotional worship. Some see worship as very contemplative, very intellectual, very reflective. In today's environment, we've added even further differences. Some add light shows, smoke machines, dimmed lights, and other sensorial experiences that are intended to help heighten the worship experience. And there's not any, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with any of that. I'm just saying it's the different ways that people look at worship. The reality of it is this, that worship does not have a particular fashion. Worship does not have a particular form. If it did, think about this with me for a second. If it did, because we do have some things in the Christian faith that are immovable and unchangeable. One of them is that there's no other way of salvation than Jesus Christ himself.
Amen.
Okay? And isn't it amazing that across the world, in Christian churches, that reality is proclaimed? And it is the same in every congregation that uses the Bible as its base to speak from and has Christ as the center of their focus. And there's no argument about it. As a matter of fact, if you go into a church and they do not declare that, that's kind of a signal that that's probably not the best place for you to be. And that you need to find a church that understands what biblical truth is as it relates to Jesus. But isn't it interesting that we find different expressions of worship all over the world? And that there are some that when I hear, I want to cover my ears. Because it doesn't fit my paradigm. And it's not because they're bad. It's just because they don't relate to me. And there are others in other places around the world who would hear us, and as wonderfully as we think we handled worship this morning, they say, "What was that? What is that big box with strings on it? And you what is that?" They don't get that, and it doesn't relate to them. Job shows us that worship is about the heart. That worship is about engaging the heart in fellowship with God. We sang a song a few years ago. Songs come and go, and this one has kind of fallen out of use. It was called "The Heart of Worship," or another subtitle to it was "When the Music Fades." And it was written by a young man from England. His name is Matt Redman, and he tells the story about how that song came to be written. Because his church that he attended, where he was a worship leader, his church had been very instrumental in England and its worship revival. They had been very much publicized and had received a lot of recognition for kind of being one of the foremost churches in that worship movement. And the pastor became concerned one day that the church was more involved in the trappings of worship and not in worship itself. And so he did a very radical thing. He turned off the sound system and said they couldn't use the sound system anymore, and removed all the musical instruments from the church. And they started doing worship with just singing alone. Nothing else. And out of that time, out of that season of needing to reorient themselves away from all the things that sometimes we might attribute to worship, he began to bring them back as a congregation to what he called the heart of worship. And it was out of that Matt Redman wrote his song, "The Heart of Worship." I'm coming back to the heart of worship, Lord. It's all about you. It's all about you. And that's a very important principle for us to grasp as we are looking at this issue of the heart of worship. Jesus said it well in John chapter 4, verses 21 through 24, that God is looking for folks who will worship in spirit and in truth. But that is what God is looking for. That worship will be driven, first of all, by the fact that it is a spiritual entity. That when we come together for worship, it is a matter of our spirits connecting with the Spirit of God. And it doesn't make any difference what the venue of worship may be. We might have a worship leader whose name people know instantly because of his notoriety and the music that he's written and the public arena in which he operates. We may have someone of just that kind of notoriety. But if that's all we have, then it's not worship in spirit. And then the second thing is, he says it must be in truth. And as I was looking at this passage in John 4, I never noticed this before. It's the story of the woman at the well. And Jesus is talking to her, And as he begins to unfold the details of her life, none of which she had told him, but that Jesus, by a word of knowledge, knew, she said, "Sir, I think you're a prophet." Yeah, well, I guess when he knows what you did in your life before you ever told him, that probably qualifies him as a prophet. And so she shifts the conversation and she says, my family says you should worship here. And you Jews say you should worship over here. And Jesus said, no, it's not a matter of that. God is looking for people who will worship in spirit and in truth. And this whole idea of worshiping in truth, it's that we worship the true God. Because she was trying to take Jesus down another path, and he said, it's not necessarily, I'm not putting that group down particularly. He said, I do want you to know this, that you can worship whatever else it is that you want to worship, and it's not going to be true worship, because you're not connecting with the true God. And so worship really becomes then worship that's done in spirit, that it's my spirit responding to God, and that I see in clear fashion who He is. That He is God, as Sherry and I just sang it. You are God alone. You are God, and you are the focus of my worship. There can be many different expressions of worship that meet this definition. And yet, Job shows us how important that it really is. Because all of these other ways of worship certainly can take us into God's presence if they follow the model that Job has given to us. So let's look at that just for a second. The first thing I want you to see with me is, number one, worship is an attitude of heart that can be expressed, and this is so interesting in Job's life, it can be expressed without musical accompaniment. How many of us, when we think of worship, think of music almost first? Or synonymously to worship? And go back with me and look at what Job did. The people come up and tell Job what happened in his life. And Job, in hearing all of the story that they've said, what does Job do? He falls down shaved his head, tore his clothes, and he falls down in worship. Where was the worship band? Where was the organ or the piano? Or the zither? Or the harp? Or the shofar? Where was that? Nowhere. Nowhere. Job fell in worship. In the most cataclysmic moment of his life, worship was in his heart. And that worship began to flow out of him because it was something that had already been installed in him. That's not an argument to say that we shouldn't have musical instruments. It simply means they're not necessary for worship. Now, here's an example of how things change with the times. David was a musical guy. David invested a lot of musical instruments. As a matter of fact, when you read in 2 Chronicles, about the 25th, 26th chapter, David has all this musical stuff going on. He's got antiphonal choirs that are on one side of the wall, they're on separate walls in the worship area, and they're singing back and forth to one another. And they've got people who are part of the Levitical priesthood whose only responsibility is to play musical instruments as part of the worship. So it isn't that there's anything wrong. I'm not saying to you today that because we have musical instruments here or some other group does whatever they do in a certain way, that somehow that's wrong. That's not my point. My point is, are we at the heart of worship? Are we at the core of what we see in Job's life, that worship flows out of him. Because it is a byproduct of who he is and a byproduct of his relationship with God. See, that becomes the heart of worship. That it is a reflection of my love for God. There is only one way Job could respond to these conditions this way. And that is, he knew the heart of God so greatly that it was not something that God would do to hurt him. Now, he may not have understood it, but it was not something that God was doing to Job to bring pain in his life in a flippant, casual, careless sort of way, as many people understood the gods of their day. How many of you have read, if you're talking about Greek mythology or any other culture of people that had gods, the gods were flippant. They were careless. If they didn't like the way you looked on a particular morning, it was the perception of that culture that they could just throw a lightning bolt at you and do something to harm you or bring difficulty into your life. They were petulant. They were childish. They responded to people on the basis of what their need was, not as our God does to respond to us according to the basis of our need. Because, folks, God has no need. He doesn't need us. He doesn't need you and I. He is not anxiously waiting in heaven, hoping we will worship him today. Because he's secure enough in who he is, he doesn't need that. But he does invite us. He does invite us to come into his presence and enjoy fellowship with him. And that's what we see happening in Job. Job knew God. Job knew God in such a way that when all of this stuff hit his life, Job's response was to come before God and say, God, you know what? It doesn't change who you are. It doesn't change the way I think about you. It doesn't change what's... Now, I know you can read the rest of Job, and it sounds like he turns around on that. But when it comes to the end of all of that, Job comes back to a recognition. That is the heart of worship. When we know who God is, and we are unshaken. We're unshaken by the circumstances of life. I used this analogy in our class a few weeks ago. If any of you, even though I know most of you very well, if any of you came to me and told me that my wife was speaking poorly of me to you, I wouldn't believe you. Because I know the relationship we have. She would not do that. There are some of you, if somebody came to me and said, well, you know what, that Gary Arnold, he did this. Not the Gary I know. Worship flows out of relationship. And folks, too often, we wait for the worship team to bring the worship to us. When what you and I have to be doing is bringing the worship with us when we come.
Amen.
Hallelujah.
We bring it with us. And we come in. Right? If Job falls on his face after he's lost everything, think about it. Everything he's worked for is gone in a poof of smoke. And Job's response is to fall before God and say, God, I didn't have anything when I came into this world. And when I leave, I'm not taking any of it with me. But you know what he's really saying here? God, you are the one constant in my life. You are the one unshakable, immovable reality in my life. And God, I choose to honor you and to recognize you in spite of everything else. Folks, that is the heart of worship. And that is what begins to make our worship transformational. Because we connect with God in a way that we've never connected before. When we begin to worship in that kind of way. By the way, if you look in Revelation chapters 4, 5, and 6, where you get a picture of the worship around the throne room of heaven. Do you know there's no musical instruments there either? As a matter of fact, when the elders fall down before God and they say, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The earth is full of His glory," they're not singing it, they're saying it. All of which comes back to the point of what the heart of worship truly is. Job, when it says that Job worshiped, the Hebrew word that's used there means that he bowed. Literally, it means that he bowed or he prostrated himself before God. I know he fell down, but there's also the idea of, and I don't know if his falling was, he kind of crumpled under the weight of what the message was. I know that there are times when folks receive a catastrophic message that they can lose the ability to stand. Their strength goes away and they just kind of crumple under the weight of that. And whether or not that's what happened, it seems like that's something that happened with Job. But it also says that he fell down and worshipped. And the literal translation, if you look up the word worship that's used here, it means to bow down. It means to bow down. Now, that's out of our culture. We don't get that. We don't get what it is to bow because we don't bow to anybody. It's the American way. I don't mean that as a political statement. It's just, we I guess probably in reaction to King George during the Revolutionary period, because people bowed to the kings of England, kings and queens. But it's not a part of our experience, and so we don't get it. But people in other cultures understand that when you bow before someone like that, there is an honor that's being given to them because they rightfully deserve it. It is theirs by virtue of who they are. And again, let's not be legalistic and say, now when we come in for worship on Sunday morning, when we sing, we actually have to bow. That isn't the point. Why did Job bow? Because in his heart, he knew that God was worthy of that kind of reverence. See, it comes back to the attitude. It comes back to the understanding that God, I'm just a peon, God. Compared to you, I am nothing. Compared to you, God, all you have to do is say to the angels in heaven, turn off the oxygen to atoms. And I'm done. It's just that simple. Someone with that kind of authority and power is worthy of my respect, would you not say?
Amen.
Yeah. He operates on a different dimension than I operate. And it's appropriate for me. In the same way, maybe this will connect with our mindset and our way of thinking. In the same way that we sometimes gnash our teeth when we see a small child speak disrespectfully to a parent. Because we understand the disconnect between the position of the child and the position of the parent. Not that the parent is heavy-handed and dictatorial. It's not that at all. It's just that the child is under the authority of the parent. And the child needs to speak in a way that reflects that authority. So it is with us and God. We are under His authority. And the heart of worship understands that and connects with God in that kind of way. See, worship is not so much what we get out of it, but it's how you and I bless God.
Amen.
Worship is not about what, and too often our focus is on what we are going to get out of worship. Do you track with me in that?
Yep.
There are too many times we come to a place of worship, whether it's here or whether it's somewhere else, and we are so locked in on what we're going to get out of it that we forget that worship is, first of all, see, what we receive is a byproduct of our worship. What you and I receive as a blessing, if you will, to God is a byproduct of our having worshiped Him well. Let me explain that. When the people of Israel would bring sacrifices in, what did they do first? They focused on what God wanted of them as an act of worship. If it was a sin offering, they had to bring an animal, and the animal had to be killed and put on the offering, put on the altar. And God then, when God received that sacrifice, then the person went away justified. And too often we want to put what we get before what God receives. So my question to you is, when you came to church today, what did you bring? What did you bring to God today? I'll ask you a question that I asked the group on Wednesday night. Why do you serve God? And let's just respond here a little bit. Why do you serve God? And if you were there on Wednesday night, don't you dare answer. Why do we serve God? Okay, there were 2 or 3 that spoke. Because He saved you, okay? Who else spoke?
Because of who He is and also because of what He's done for me.
Who He is and what He's done. Okay, and Chelsea was not there on Wednesday. Esty?
Yes, because we depend on Him and we know He loves us no matter what we do.
Okay.
And He's willing to forgive us.
Okay. Anyone else?
Because He's our Father.
Because He's our Father. Okay. And that gets at the heart of it.
Maybe worthy of
That
my
He
love.
is worthy?
Yes.
Very good.
Because we respect who He is in our lives.
Okay. It was interesting. Sylvia, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say Jesus was an example of being a servant, so we should serve too.
Okay. Okay. What is Job's reason for worshiping God? The relationship he had with Him. And in the words that he says, what is it that he conveys about his understanding of God?
He brought him in, and
You take them out.
he's there in the beginning, and he's there at the end.
He the boss.
Everything else. Yeah.
Okay? He the boss. He the big man. Okay? You are God. I know I've told you this before. There's 2 principles of worship. There is a God, number 1. Number 2, I am not Him. Okay? I am not Him. That's the heart of worship. We worship God because He's God. Not because He does things for us. Not because He gives things to us. Not because we are going to receive eternal life. Not for any of the things that we so often say is our reason for serving Him. We serve Him because He is sovereign. Everything that exists came out of His creative authority. And it comes to us. And by virtue of that, He is the one that we worship. I want to close by reading you just some of the lyrics of this of the song that I referenced earlier, because it's just so absolutely on target. First verse says this: when the music fades and all is stripped away, and I simply come, longing just to bring something that's of worth that will bless your heart. I'll bring you more than a song, for a song in itself is not what you've required. You search much deeper within through the way things appear. You're looking into my heart. So that's what worship becomes. When all is stripped away, when the music fades, and all the things that we associate with worship are no longer there. Sherry was telling, as I was discussing my message this morning with Sherry, she related an instance. Who was the person? Missionary to China from a number of years ago. Talked about being in an underground church in China where they couldn't sing. They had no musical instruments. And they couldn't sing because they would be heard by the people around them. And so they would whisper their worship. As a matter of fact, how would...
They would sing, they were just whispering, praising the Lord,
Yeah.
all together.
Yeah. See, here's the deal. Worship, the heart of worship will find a way to worship. The heart of worship will find a way to worship. Now, you and I may have to think our way through it. We may have to think our way past a place where we might be worshiping on a particular day that their style might be a little different than ours. But folks, there is not a reason for us to not be able to worship. Except maybe you can't speak the language. But even then, you can join in the spirit of worship, can you not? I've asked the worship team to come back. No, you know what, folks, I think I'm going to change that, because our time is getting away. Do you hear my heart this morning? I have a passion for us as a church to move into new dimensions of worship. Dimensions that go beyond singing songs and feeling like we worship. God wants to meet us. God wants to meet us right here. He wants to display His glory among us. Let's not let anything affect or infect our hearts that causes us to be distracted. Now, I've said this, I know that one of the worst things that can happen that will interrupt the worship more quickly than anything is an out-of-tune instrument. And as a musician, there's not anything that drives me crazier, because there's no excuse for it. There will always be distractions. You think Job was distracted? Yeah. Could have been. He just lost everything. And yet, he worshiped. What would happen if, as we came to church, and I would like for you to pick this thought up, and I really would like for you to write it on notes that you're taking this morning or tomorrow or next Sunday when we come. What are you bringing as an offering? What are you bringing as an offering? In the same way that the people of the Old Testament would bring animals or grain or other objects, because they were asked to bring that, it was a prescribed offering. But what will you bring next Sunday? Or the next worship opportunity that we have? What will you bring? That will be an expression of your love for God, and that you offer it, not expecting any return, but simply offering it because of your relationship with Him and your love for Him and your gift back to Him. The heart